and welcome to PT Kids Live with me, Daniel Woods, the director of PT Kids and a specialist children's physio. Today I've got with me a very special guest and we're going to be talking about what can a PT Kids OT offer to your neurodiverse child. I'm here with specialist children's occupational therapist Liz Knowles. Liz is a fantastic OT and she joined PT Kids in January of 2019. Hello Liz and welcome.
Morning Dan.
Thanks for joining us, Liz. I wonder if you could perhaps start by telling us just a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background.
Yes, thank you. Well, basically, I've been working as a paediatric occupational therapist since 1989, which makes me a bit long in the tooth. But that length of experience has been so valuable to me. I've worked in many areas around the UK, which has given me a real diverse experience. I've worked with children with bone disease more recently, but also with children with complex and multiple disabilities. Since I've been working with PT Kids, I have been mainly working with children with coordination difficulties, fine motor skill difficulties, and autistic spectrum disorder, which has been really interesting.
From my point of view, Liz, I can't really speak highly enough about your involvement in the team since you joined last year. You've brought a real breadth of knowledge to the team, but not only that, you've thrown yourself into learning new things, and you're really innovative in the way that you approach treatment with the children, and you really do go that extra mile to help the children achieve their goals. So Liz, we're going to talk a little bit today about the neurodiverse child, but what does neurodiverse actually mean?
Well, I guess the way I view neurodiversity is the way in which a child responds to his environment and how that might affect how he or she functions on a daily basis, whether it's a school activity or independence at home or activities in the community.
So does neurodiversity relate to any particular form or diagnoses at all?
So in my experience, the diagnoses generally relating to neurodiversity would include autistic spectrum disorder, which includes pathological demand avoidance or pervasive developmental disorder, Asperger's, or other comorbidities such as dyspraxia, dyslexia, or executive functioning. And that's not an exhaustive list, but those are the general conditions that I might become involved with.
So on a day-to-day basis, what are the most common problems or common symptoms that families or teachers might tend to notice in their children with these conditions?
So these come in four broad categories. The first being motor skills, that's fine and gross motor difficulties. Second being activities of daily living and life skills. The third being sensory difficulties, and finally social and emotional issues.
So if we think about gross and fine motor skills then, Liz, what are the typical things that families report their children to have difficulties with in this area?
From a fine motor perspective, they report that they'll have difficulty engaging in fine motor activities, especially writing, which makes schoolwork a complete nightmare for the child and the parents, especially through lockdown. This has been very difficult for some families. Also cutting skills, difficulty with manipulating the scissors, being able to turn the corners, and general difficulties with craft activities. They might also report difficulty with cutting up food, and fastenings on clothes can also be a real challenge to them. From a gross motor perspective, the families might report the children as clumsy, slow walkers, have an awkward gait, but they might also report that their struggle in PE, and PE is a real issue for the child.
I can definitely relate to a lot of those, particularly from a gross motor point of view. So from a physio perspective, we do see a lot of these types of children who present with hypermobility or bendy joints, or you might see them as being flat-footed. Also, they might walk on their tiptoes, so they might have difficulty with their walking pattern. Something a lot of families might notice or report is that their child might trip over or fall quite a lot, and that's another thing to look out for our families at home. So Liz, what are the types of difficulties that families tend to report when it comes to personal care and their activities of daily living?
So very common issues relate to toileting. It might be that the child doesn't get to the toilet in time, perhaps doesn't recognise when they need to go to the toilet, or when after they use the toilet, they have difficulty with the hygiene, wiping their bottoms, that sort of thing. It might be that they actually don't get the signal through their neuro system to actually recognise that they need to use the toilet. They also have difficulties with dressing, not just with fastenings. They may struggle to follow a sequence, to put the items on the right way round or in the right order. They also have poor sleep routines. It might be that they have a habit of going to bed very late, and families are often struggling with sleep deprivation because the child might be going to bed at 9 but don't settle till midnight or 2 in the morning, and then they continue to get up and down in the night, which makes everybody tired in the mornings. Also, they might not be able to manage changes in the daily routine, so being able to follow weekends activities within the family, whether they have a shopping trip or going to swimming lessons, that might be a challenge to them.
And probably particularly topical at the moment will be that change of routine. We've just got through lockdown, and at this point in time children are just heading back to school, which is going to have been really disruptive to a lot of children and been a massive change in some of their usual day-to-day routines. So when it comes to sensory issues, this is often a really well talked about difficulty. We're contacted by a lot of families who describe their child as having sensory processing difficulties. What are the sorts of things that families are reporting with regards to sensory difficulties?
Okay, so families will initially tell me about the child's difficulty with change of routine, having meltdowns, not wanting to be touched, not liking their possessions to be touched or moved. It might be that they are particularly sensitive to bright lights or loud noises and can't tolerate these. They might not be able to cope when the television is on a louder volume, and they might want to retreat into their own room. They might shut the blinds, curtains. They might want to make a nest in their bed in order to get away from the overwhelming sensory pressures within the home. Parents report that their children are fussy or picky eaters. They might choose bland coloured foods. They might only tolerate certain textures of food, and there may be concerns about the amount of calories that the child is or isn't having each day. They might report that the child is chewing on their clothing or on toys or pens, and they might report that their child appears to need to rush around in order to calm down. They might also report aggressive outbursts, particularly when they don't get their own way on certain issues, including access to technology or when demands are made upon them. Interestingly, parents comment that they have difficulties at home, but commonly the child presents with fewer difficulties at school, but will then return home and have a meltdown because of the pressure they've been under at school, causing them anxiety.
I'm certain there'll be a lot of parents out there who will relate to the idea that their children will behave quite differently at school, and then they'll come home and behave a very different way at home for them. And this anxiety, that is kind of leading into the next area that you mentioned. And again, it's quite topical in this world of COVID that we're living in at the moment. And that's children having difficulties with their social and emotional well-being. What kind of things are parents reporting in this area?
Parents report to me that their child may have an emotional outburst but be unable to explain what it is that's wrong with them. They feel the child doesn't recognise their own various emotions and may be reluctant to share their feelings with other people, particularly at school. This then leads to the outbursts in the home situation where they feel safe and free to express themselves in the only way they know how. Parents also report that their children find it really hard to join in group activities such as going to clubs or going to the park with friends and joining in on a mutual basis. Parents commonly report that their children also have difficulty even in a family group meeting, for instance family parties or just meeting with cousins and grandparents. So that can really restrict family activities going ahead and in a calm and relaxed manner.
I'm sure a lot of the things you've described there sound really familiar to a lot of our families listening. And what we would always suggest is that if you're having some difficulties at home, or if your child's having some difficulties at school, that you should seek some help or seek out another professional with expertise in the thing that your child's really struggling with. We are here to help, and we're happy to take contact from any family member or any parent who feels like they're having difficulties at home. So if we think a little bit, Liz, about the types of things that we offer here, what would an OT assessment involve for a child?
So we use a variety of standardised assessments, and these are particularly helpful when families are pursuing additional support in school through an EHCP. However, they're also really good evidence of progress and identifying specific needs of the child. So we have access to a wide range of standardised assessments that cover gross motor coordination, fine motor coordination, visual motor abilities, handwriting, as well as activities of daily living. But we also have in-house functional assessments that we can do, which might pick up aspects of functional abilities that aren't addressed in the standardised versions.
So one thing a lot of families get in touch with us and ask us about, and one thing a lot of families will request, is they'll ask for a sensory assessment. So I just wondered, Liz, if you could perhaps tell us a little bit, what does that actually mean? What is a sensory assessment, and what is it that the family's asking for when they come to us and ask for a sensory assessment?
So the most common sensory assessment I would use is the Sensory Profile 2, which is a caregiver's questionnaire and covers ages birth to 17. The importance of any sensory assessment is more to identify the child's challenges to participation in school, home and the community. However, what is much more important is understanding how these sensory processing difficulties might affect the children in everyday life, and providing the most appropriate intervention to promote sensory regulation and strategies to reduce stress and anxiety and facilitate functional skill acquisition.
That's great. So I guess kind of what you're describing there is it's not just about identifying what the sensory issues are, but how they then impact on the child's day-to-day life and how it stops them from doing the things that they want to do.
Exactly.
So once you've identified what the main problems are, what kind of treatment are you able to offer?
Okay, so we are able to offer a selection of modes of therapy, including weekly therapy at home or school, followed up by review, or we can offer daily therapy program to be followed in home or school, dependent on the age of the child and restrictions within school. We also provide advice and equipment prescription to accompany any therapy programs devised. This might include seating, such as a wobble cushion or a wobble stool, flexible footband, weighted lap mat or a compression vest. It's important to remember that therapy should be strengths-based for best outcomes, as child engagement is essential in therapy and challenge-based is a huge demotivator to therapy. It's also important to follow a routine, be predictable, and be clear and literal in your instructions.
That sounds great. I really like the idea of focusing on things that the child is good at, or focus on things that they can be successful at to help keep them motivated, rather than always worrying about the things that they can't do and focusing on that. So do you have any particular examples where this has worked really well with some of the children that you've been working with?
One of the biggest challenges that children face is having difficulty with emotional regulation. And in this instance, we would work towards developing emotional awareness through the use of an emotion thermometer or the 5-point scale or emotion PACS cards or social stories. And these in turn help the child to understand what it is they're actually feeling, and they might learn to recognise the triggers to their meltdowns, and then how to learn to manage them using vestibular and proprioceptive tools such as heavy work or weighted equipment, as well as using sensory brain breaks and sensory motor activities such as a motor pathway.
That sounds like a really interesting approach to help children who are having problems with anxiety. But I wondered, Liz, if you might be able to talk to us a little bit about our approach to managing children who have sensory difficulties and what you would do to help those children.
Well, it has to be very needs-based and dependent on an individual's needs. We've got lots of tools in our toolkit that we can draw on. I would usually use a sensory diet that's designed specifically to support the child's regulation based on their specific sensory preferences. And I would include movement breaks within the school day, as this is beneficial for focus and attention within the classroom. Education of the family and school staff is absolutely essential to ensure that the diet and the plan is well understood and maintained. Any sensory one-to-one therapy should be suitable for the environment it takes place in, and it can require innovative planning dependent on the equipment that you're planning to use, whether it's a sensory motor pathway or a swing or gym ball. Regulation needs to be established before more challenging tasks are attempted for best outcomes. For instance, if I wanted to attempt a more challenging fine motor task, I would always ensure that the child had done some heavy work beforehand and developed some focus by working on some auditory processing, some listening skills, and maybe some using a feely box to use their tactile system to identify hidden objects before attempting a fine motor control task, because we're much more likely to achieve a successful outcome.
That's great. I really like the idea of having lots of different tools in the toolkit.
I think it's a case of one size does not fit all.
And I also really like the idea that therapy is really focused around the individual child, and it takes into account the environment and the task and looks at ways of modifying those to help get the best outcome. So thanks very much for joining me today, Liz. That's been a really interesting insight into some of the ways that we can help children with autism and some of its associated difficulties. So if that brief insight has got you thinking that you might benefit from having a discussion with an occupational therapist, or if you're interested in booking to see Liz or any other of our occupational therapists, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can visit ptkids.co.uk, you can get us on social media at ptkidsuk, or just drop me an email, office@ptkids.co.uk. We've had some great feedback about the support that we provide to children with autistic spectrum disorder. In fact, one of our families recently said, "This service is great. The occupational therapist provided an excellent service for my child, and her support was invaluable to me and our child and she helped me with our SEN tribunal case, and she would definitely recommend us and use us again. So why not get in touch and find out how a PT Kids OT can help you and your neurodiverse child today.